Somehow, most of the talk today around the war in Ukraine revolves around the claim that Russia started this war because this is how it asserts itself as a great power. Little is said about what does it mean to be a great power today and what all of this has to do with Ukraine. One way or another, all explanations, they come down to repeating a claim from the 19th century by a Russian chancellor, Alexander Gorchakov, who once said that great powers do not ask for recognition, they reveal themselves as such. And so it is said, Russia today, tired of asking to recognize its legitimate security concerns, is now extracting these recognitions by force. What is missed in these accounts is that when Gorchakov himself at some point was urged to intervene and to intervene unilaterally in the Ottoman Empire, he responded by saying, "Nous sommes une grande impuissance." We are the great impotent. And some argue today that it is precisely these grande impuissance, great impotence, rather than grande puissance, great power, that Russia is revealing to the world in this war, and that this embarrassing revelation is of Putin's own making. So the question here then is, why is he doing that? Is it a miscalculation rooted in a number of delusions, including one of his major claims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, from which it sort of follows that there are no grounds for there being a Ukrainian state at all. And this is something I want to look at in a little bit more detail, because I think there is more to it than just Putin's delusions. There is a long-standing and very powerful story in Russia which feeds this kind of discourse. And this story is worthy of unpacking just a little bit. It so happened that it was precisely in today's Ukraine, by Poltava, that Russia for the first time revealed itself indeed as a great European power by defeating Sweden in a series of wars. But the question to be asked there is what brought both Russia and Sweden to that point? What brought them to Ukraine? What brought them to Poltava? And one of the most intriguing things there is that, different as these two states were, the underlying reason was pretty much the same. 1 century before Peter the Great, Swedish ruler Gustavus Adolphus reformed his country, turning it into a modern European state, and wanted recognition of that fact from those who mattered at that time. Primarily it was Austro-Hungarian rulers and the Holy Roman Empire generally. But this recognition was not forthcoming, and so he marched his troops all the way to Central Europe. That's the beginning of the Swedish Empire. Peter the Great actually wanted exactly the same thing. He wanted Russia to be reformed and then recognized as a more or less modern European state. So although the security interests of the two states actually clashed in a number of ways, first in Narva, what is today Estonia, then by Poltava, there was this underlying agreement that they wanted the same thing, this, to be part of this European modernity, and they understood this European modernity more or less the same way. And this is why, through this clash, although one of the states was defeated and the other one was rapidly rising, what also emerged, at least according to some account, is actually a system of European ordering which heavily relied on great powers as important parts of that system. And that system developed over the years and eventually was institutionalized here in Vienna as this concert of Europe, or concert of Vienna. Both Gustavus Adolphus in his time and then Peter I in Russia, they were both recognized and honored by their own states as the great leaders. Both were called the Great. But the Russian story was a little bit more complicated because there was always an alternative. There were always people who opposed Peter's reforms. And their opposition took many different terms and forms, but one particular form which is directly related to Ukraine took shape after the Russian Revolution, after the First World War, as a tradition of thought which is known as Eurasianism. And for Eurasianism, the key point in history was not the 18th century and what happened by Poltava, but 13th century, when a string of small Russian principalities between the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea was trying to establish themselves, facing two different pressures. On the one hand, they were pressured by small rising powers in the West, increasingly supported by the Holy Roman Empire and the Roman Catholic Church. And on the other side, they were pressured by Mongols and Tatars, who at that time were unquestionably more powerful militarily, but whose political organization, the Golden Horde, was already showing some first signs of decline. And so it was a very difficult choice at that point, and very difficult position. And two Russian princes, both members of the same family, made two very different choices. One of them, Daniil Galitsky, he allied himself with the West and laid down the foundations of what now is Ukraine. The other one, Alexander Nevsky, went in the opposite direction and aligned himself with the Horde against the West. Now, it is interesting that in the last years of the rule of President Yeltsin, his close advisors were really pushing this narrative in which they were trying to establish some connection between Boris Yeltsin and Peter the Great. But with Putin, especially in his later years, the main sort of character whom you see mythologized, idolized, canonized, is actually Alexander Nevsky, as was the case with Stalin at around the time of the Second World War. Now, why is that the case? And here Eurasian explanation is very interesting, because Eurasians were fully with Alexander Nevsky. Although others, like, for example, great Russian historian Danilevsky, he argued that that was the wrong choice. That is why this long-standing tradition of authoritarianism persists in Russia. But Eurasians thought differently. They thought that it was the right choice because the Mongols and the Tatars, they were absolutely indifferent about Russian culture and Orthodox religion. They just couldn't care less. They collected taxes, they forcefully recruited Russian men into their armies as needed, but they didn't care about identity, about culture, about religion, or, as we say today, about ideology. This is very similar to what China is doing in its rise to the status of the global power, when, for example, in Africa, it practices what in all appearances is economic colonization, but without setting up any ideological or political conditions. And in his latest remarks, Putin, but also his foreign minister, Lavrov, indicated in more than one way that this seems to be their preference. They actually want to disengage from the West, and they believe that Western sanctions would actually help them to achieve that, and in the end, Russia would only be better off. Now, there is one part of the Eurasian story which is missing from all this, because Eurasians also argued another thing. They were interested in the question, why is it then that eventually Russia managed to free itself from the Tatar yoke, as it was called in Russia, and actually move eastwards forcefully, recapturing all these territories? And their answer to that, again, to rephrase it in contemporary terms, was ideology. Sort of paradoxically, they chose, Alexander Nevsky chose alliance with the Horde because of the Horde's ideological indifference. But that very ideological indifference was the reason for the Horde's decline, because without the ideology you cannot build stable institutions that would last for sort of generations. And Russia, having learned a lot from the Horde, could add just this missing bit and created a very specific Eurasian synthesis, a synthesis of its European and Asian identity, which proved to be stronger than, for example, the Horde and, as Eurasians believed, also the West. But this part, this emphasis on culture and ideology, is completely missing from Putin's justification for the war in Ukraine, which he gave in his speech on February 24. There he actually acknowledges that some countries are more attractive than others. He acknowledges that some states are more technologically developed than others. But then he immediately says, but all this is always changing. There are things that never change. And things that never change are geography and ethnicity. Hence this claim of his that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. But if you take ideology out of Eurasian tradition, what you end up with is kind of straightforward interwar German geopolitics, based on this belief that political decisions can be made by just looking at the map. And why is it that Putin believes that? And I think there is a very clear explanation to that. Again, if you look at the history of Ukrainian and Russian relations after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because Russia failed to be attractive for its neighbors, at least on its western borders. Unlike Belarus, on the other hand, or Baltic states, on the other hand, Ukrainians could not decide for a very long time which way do they want to go. And obviously Russia tried to exploit that. But when in 2014, Ukrainians said that they actually want to go west, the only thing that Putin could offer them to prevent them from going west was billions of dollars. And when they said no, Then came the troops. And that's when the annexation of Crimea happens. To translate it into sort of different terms, Russia has serious problems with what we call soft power, with trying to make people and states do what it wants without coercion, by simply offering attractive alternatives. And it has these problems not only internationally, it has these problems at home as well, where they tried to create something like an ideology through various kind of attempts, but none of them worked so far. And it remains a big gamble, it remains a big question. How would Putin be able to convince Russians to suffer through the inevitable decline of the economy and so on and so forth without any ideology to support that? And the only ideology that he kind of sketched out right now is straightforward nationalism. It's this division of all the Russians into the true Russians, patriots, and the term he started using after the annexation of Crimea, national traitors. And again, these identities are kind of fixed, just like geography is. So in this sense, what this war revealed is indeed Russian impotence, and you can say that in some sense Putin has already failed. There is another question here and another task if we go back to sort of a model formulated by Boris Johnson. The task is not just to make Putin fail, this he made himself, but to make him seen as failing. And the question here is, how do you do that, especially if when this war is over, Putin most probably gets something. We do not know what that is: Crimea, eastern part of Ukraine, neutral status of Ukraine, but he will get something, and he will try to spin this as his victory. So how is it possible to make him be seen as failing? And that leads to another question, and I think that's actually the main question. Because in Western reactions to Putin's aggression, there is a lot of things which actually reminds me, at least, of precisely what Putin is advocating. This idea of, okay, here's the West, which is united, which is all the same, which is against Russia. There is a new Iron Curtain, or whatever we call it eventually. There is a new Cold War. But the problem is that this is precisely the kind of thinking that Putin is advocating. This is the kind of thinking which underlines his aggression in Ukraine. So there is another way? I think there is. So this kind of Putin's discourse of demonizing the enemy, it does not hold everywhere. That's the first thing. But the second thing, coming back to this kind of origins of great power system and to the rivalry between Sweden and Russia. Remember, Gustavus Adolphus in the 17th century, rise in Sweden to the rank of European great powers. Then in the 18th century, Peter the Great doing the same. And now a lot of people are talking about the Baltic states as the next target of Putin. I personally do not believe that, and I'm not the only one. When Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas was asked about that, are you going to be next? She said something very interesting. She said, look, between Kiev and Tallinn, it is 1,300 kilometers. And between Kiev and Berlin, there is 1,300 kilometers. So basically what she was saying, why are you comparing us to Ukraine rather than, say, to Berlin? we are in a different situation. Of course, yes, we know that these are 1,300 kilometers in very different directions, but that is not the point. The point is that geography is not given. It is not what you immediately see on the map. It is how you understand it. It is what you make of it. And if you actually go to Estonia, and if you go to the second largest city in Estonia, Tartu, then what you see there is something very interesting, because within walking distance from each other, there is a huge monument to Peter the Great and various sites commemorating Gustavus Adolphus, the biggest of which is, of course, Tartu University. And that tells me that Putin is wrong, that you cannot draw these clear lines between peoples, states, identities. You cannot see the real differences on the map by just looking on the map. Our histories, our geographies, our cultures, our peoples, they're actually interlinked. And they're everywhere, not just like at the borders, you know. And if we manage to stress that, if we manage that to be the norm, rather than whatever Putin is trying to convince us of, then Putin will be seen as failing, you know. And you can see that you don't even have to travel to Tartu, you know. Just go to Hauptbahnhof, and there at Hauptbahnhof every night you see Ukrainian refugees, and you see local Russians helping them, including CU people, by the way, and you would see how these Ukrainians are often just happy to hear Russian speech. So Putin has already failed. The task ahead, and it's a task for us, not for him, not just for Zelensky or Ukrainians. It's the task for all of us to make not Putin, but Putinism to be seen as failing, to be seen that on some level, in spite of what French President Emmanuel Macron is saying now, that sovereignty matters. Yes, sovereignty matters, but on some level, it's not just Ukrainians and Russians. We are all one people in some very, very important way, which we should not forget. And if we don't, if we find a way to express it somehow, then Putin will not just fail, which he already has, but will be seen as failing.